So you know those times where it really looks like a game should be good, but then it comes out and it very much isn't? That's what happened to the Callisto Protocol. Like, in many ways, that thing looked impressive, but it basically didn't really feel like a finished game. Funnily enough, that might actually be because it wasn't a finished game. And if true, executive meddling directly murdered it. Now, the game came out in 2022, it had a muted reception, it had, I would say, relatively low sales, especially compared to what the execs actually wanted. The run-up to launch was a little bit suspicious. I mean, you had the director talking about crunch, which is never a good sign because it usually means that something has not went to plan. When the game came out, well, what we basically had was technical problems, design issues, and it just didn't land in the way that the studio striking distance intended. Now, though, things get a little bit fun because we get to ask the question, what if it had came out when it was actually meant to? What if it came out in the way that the developer actually intended? Yeah, this is a weird story, and I'm going to ask you for just 15 seconds. If you're new around here, we've had loads of new viewers lately. Could you please give the subscribe button a click? And the reason I say that's really simple. It gives YouTube a positive signal. You know how the algorithm works, right? And that helps get our videos out to more people. And that means that I'm able to gather more of the resources that I need to make the show better. So that's very much the goal. With that said, Callisto Protocol. Now, I want you to keep something in mind here. Callisto Protocol came out on the 2nd of December 2022. Now, that's a really weird release date, and it's certainly one that American companies within the games industry try not to do. It's generally too late, it's too close to Christmas, it's competing with loads of other consumer spending. It's a little weird when a AAA game, I mean certainly one with a budget like this one, comes out at that time. Do keep that in mind because it's going to be relevant soon. Now, what's happened is an interview with Glen Schofield from Dan Allen Games, and this is revealed that after a really great start, the relationship between Krafton and Striking Distance became adversarial and demanding, and ultimately, that is what kind of ruined things for the game. The most important and almost certainly the most damaging thing is the release date was promised at one point to be in 2023, but was then moved up by 3.5 months. So, can you imagine working on a project that's scoped to like a year and a half or a year and just losing 3.5 months? That is absolutely goddamn insane. So here's the quote. It actually was in October or September of 2021. I was told, quote, "You're going to get the time, just no regrets." That was the term that kept being used. No regrets, just put whatever you want into the game. And so that ends up being the plan for the next while. Glenn goes on to say that he just worked on that over his Christmas vacation, that he was designing, coming up with other ideas and things like that. But then, well, what happens is he comes back to work in January and Krafton basically say, no, actually, you're not releasing in 2023. You are releasing in December of 2022. And that means that in January 2022, Callisto Protocol went from having 15.5 months of development left to only having 12 months. That's basically losing 20% of the planned development time. We've all played games that feel 80% done. Yeah, this is the kind of thing that happens. Anyway, what Schofield says, though, is this isn't a case where you can just remove time from the equation and end up with the same result. You've got to balance things out. Like, to risk oversimplifying things, it's the core principle that if, say, one dressmaker will make you a dress in 9 weeks, but if that's to say you want the dress in 1 week, maybe you're going to need 9 dressmakers. Just that, of course, in reality, it's worse than that, because while, yes, you may need 9 dressmakers, perhaps you'll also need, I don't know, 2 managers, HR, and all the other things to support that team, the layers of management. So it's one of those challenging things. If you want something to happen in a compressed space of time, you are going to need a larger team. But the larger your team gets, the less efficient it ends up being, the more that you risk things like talent dilution, and the more that you then need to bake in inefficiencies in the form of process to actually get things working, because, scale is basically inherently a nightmare. So with all of this in mind, Glenn tells Krafton that they're not going to save any money from this delay because he's just going to need 30 to 40 more people to actually make the new timeline work. But basically, Krafton just pressed on because this was actually not about saving money for them. We'll get on to why later, and of course you've also got to remember this is all 2021, and things are going on in 2021 that maybe would have reduced team efficiency. So what ended up happening is they were getting cut to pieces and they weren't getting support from Krafton. What Glenn says is this: you have a studio of 200 to 250 people, 10 to 20 people a month were getting sick, and they were getting sick for weeks, right? We were devastated. Sometimes our whole department of visual effects would be out, our animation department, you know? And when he basically says that he'd call Korea about these sorts of things, it just wasn't really taken seriously. So that's quite rough. Now, of course, there was another big change in 2021 in the games industry. The change that, of course, has resulted, or at least partially resulted, in nearly 12,000 layoffs in just this 1 year. And that is that games looked like an amazing investment opportunity during the pandemic. People were locked up at home, way more video games were being played, and that just led to surging revenues and a little bit of a speculative bubble being popped up. So what would happen is loads of these companies would become flush with cash, and they would start offering real absurd salaries, like really big ones. Glen quoted 110 grand while working from home. Now, the problem that this would have posed for someone like Striking Distance is, well, they're a smaller team with less clout. That ended up being a really big challenge because you got to remember, it's not only the big companies, poaching staff off each other, it's also there being like a lot of startups that were getting a lot of investment. I mean, as an example, and this is definitely one of the higher up ones, but I actually heard of Senior Animation, somebody basically losing a prospect to that because they were given an offer that was like well north of 300 grand. So that's challenging, and Glen says that they had 49 people quit because of this in 2021, and it's what Glen anyway calls the Great Resignation. So all of this was going on. I think you can imagine it's not great. They've lost months of their schedule. Their team keeps on, having sickness and that kind of thing. And they're also having loads of people quit. And that's all in an environment where hiring is really hard because there's a lot of money just around the system. Yet through all that, they were able to hit their deadline on the 2nd of December. And, well, it really does suck. Why? Basically, they cut 2.5 bosses from the game, 3 or 4 different enemy types as well, and they were doing all of this while they were trying to finish the game on time. And that meant that they had to cut things for the sake of speed, but they weren't really able to make the design fully work, as it was, of course, intended at the start of 2022. And that was very much spoken for in the reviews, where yes, there was performance issues, stuff like that we're maybe a bit more used to, but then just design decisions that felt odd. Things that felt just really half-baked, not really that well conceived. And it turns out that by the end of 2021, all of these things were probably quite well conceived. Problem, of course, was they lost time and they had loads of issues. They ended up on OpenCritic having a 67 average and a 42% recommendation, which is obviously not great. Some stuff was then chalked up to just sort of, the DLC will come in and make a lot of things better, and that just didn't really happen. Now, the first signs of all this that we got was crunch. Basically, they crunched it, and Glen basically said that he was proud of the team. That's one of those things where I do understand how, at the time, right, you basically have Glen being like, yep, we have had to do so much crunch to make this happen, and I'm really proud of the team. And then people are basically saying, well, that's probably bad. You've probably burnt out all your staff. Why are you proud that you managed your game poorly, that you managed your schedule poorly and burned everybody out? That seemingly is silly. And of course, he will then say, well, here's all of this context, which we can now talk about today. I mean, as an example at the time, this is what Jason Schreier tweeted in response. This, from a studio head, is crunch culture defined. Of course, nobody is forced to work insane hours, but imagine the reduced bonuses and lack of promotion opportunities if you don't. You do it because you love it. Weaponized passion, this is why people burn out of gaming. You can totally understand what he's saying there. The challenge here, though, is, well, the context maybe changes things. You can totally understand why Schofield would be proud, right? Like, you can get Jason's logic, yes, but the reason why Schofield is proud is probably because he knows they have been dealt a stupidly shit hand, and it's basically a miracle that they ended up shipping the game, so he's going to be proud at how the team were able to come together. Even though, of course, yes, they'll have been burning the candle at both ends, almost certainly to the point of creating, burnout and all of those bad things that end up just undermining the long-term viability of a studio. So it's really a case of Striking Distance being under insane pressure from Krafton and them just being, backs up against the wall and being forced to deliver. And of course, they had to deliver because if they didn't, they would lose their jobs. Hence the crunch happening. Now, some people will relish the challenge, and I know, in terms of personality type, I would generally be one of those. Like, if you say to me, okay, this is going to be shit, but welcome to 3 months of hell, there is a large part of me that will think, hell yeah, let's do this. The problem, though, is that is not always wise, and you end up just kind of hurting yourself in the process, so there's always a balance. And it's fair to say that I'd probably find that to be quite easy to do, because, like, this is the channel that I've built. And one of the follow-ups from Jason actually is quite strong, where he basically says it's easy to mistake obligation for enthusiasm when you happen to be the guy who controls all their salaries, titles, and current employment status. So you can definitely see Schreier's point. It does seem scathing, it also does seem fair, but if you think about it from the perspective of, like, Schofield and Striking Distance, well, they literally had no choice because of the pressures that they were getting from Krafton. So you then end up in a situation that's all about pragmatism. That basically is your limitation. Perhaps you're not going to get more staff, you're not going to get more time, you basically have to ship with what you've got. So that could just be a case where working in a normal, healthy, sustainable way is actually not going to work, which of course can then mean that it's an unsustainable thing, because if you sustainably fail to ship a project on time, then yes, while you may have worked sustainably, the broader situation is not sustainable, therefore it goes to zero, you lose your job. Once again, Catch-22 is a great book. So when you have a high-pressure situation like that, some personality types, I'm probably one of them, will just say, all right, fuck it, this is going to be gnarly, but let's go. The thing is, if you do that too much, you can end up just doing yourself a bit of brain damage. And as Jason Schreier did point out as well, it can be very easy to mistake obligation for enthusiasm when, in the case of Glen, you're the guy who's controlling people's salaries, titles, employment status, and all of that. Not that much of that ended up mattering, because they did in fact lose their jobs. After the game came out and only sold 2 million copies rather than the 5 million Krafton was allegedly expecting, 32 staff from the around 200 were let go. And then only a few months later, Striking Distance's CFO, COO, and CEO, that's Glen, they all left of their own accord, which does mean that the studio now is just doing things for Krafton, but the actual the management, they basically all just left. So you're probably looking at all this and thinking, my god, why did any of this happen? Like, why did Krafton go so insane and pull the release forward by 3.5 months? Well, per Schofield, Krafton went public in August 2021, and that basically changed motivations. He says, we went public and it put an awful strain of the company on the board of directors and everyone else, and then they, as in Krafton, put the strain on us probably. Now, this is, of course, stuff that is all obviously terrible in hindsight, but you can probably piece together how it happens. I mean, they go public, and then Krafton's leadership starts to become strained by needing to show shareholders that they're actually making money, that they are getting results now, especially at the end of their first full financial year as a publicly traded company. And perhaps that then led to pressures on Schofield as the leader of Striking Distance, that maybe led to cutting the timeline to make sure the Callisto Protocol's launch sales would count for fiscal year 2022, and allegedly they were expecting 5 million sales, so if their plan had have worked, maybe things would have been fantastic. But of course, their plan was stupid and self-defeating. Now, if you're in America or the UK or many other countries, you might be thinking, but you're talking about the calendar year, not the fiscal year. No, not in Korea. Krafton's a Korean company, and the Korean fiscal year ends December 31st. So remember the date and the framing that I gave to you earlier? Money in February or March would have been fine for many other companies, but Krafton wanted results in that fiscal year, and that is why it had to come out in December. Basically, money in December was more important to them than a better game in April, and that just all, of course, spiraled downhill and ended up killing this game. It is one C-suite decision made for short-term reasons that hurt everybody involved, of course, including and perhaps especially the C-suite. And I think that's the angle that almost makes it the most depressing. Like, you could understand if they did all of these mercenary decisions and somehow the system rewarded them. But no, actually, the devs get screwed over, we get screwed over, all so that they can screw themselves over by just being incompetent and making bad decisions. That's why it's so pointless and frustrating. Ultimately, one of the last things that Dan Allen asked is, if Schofield was to do something different, what would it be? And Schofield said, one thing, put my foot down, I'm not shipping. Yeah, if you want a game to ship, then you can come take over the studio and ship it. Sometimes you don't know who you are, And 4 or 5 years ago, I was like, well, who am I to tell these guys I'm not going to ship the game? and in hindsight, he feels like he just should have said no. And that's the situation. Schofield felt like he couldn't say no, and I'm sure a few of his staff, when it came to all the crunch, also felt like they couldn't say no because they probably realized the context they were in, and all of that because Krafton just decided to hurt itself. So, thanks Krafton, you morons, you really screwed up that one. And that's really it for this video. If you'd like to see more from the channel, please do consider hitting the subscribe button. It helps us get the content out there to more people, and that means I can put more back into the show. But okay, have a great day. See you next time.